The QVB is really one of my favourite buildings in all of Sydney. If you pause and take a look inside and out, there is so much attention to detail and so much expert craftsmanship that has been put to work all over the building. But before we discuss the structure itself, let's dig a little deeper into the site's history. If we rewind back all the way to 1810 or so, then you'll find that our fifth governor, Macquarie, moved a fresh food produce market from the Rocks, which is down at Sydney Cove, so that it could begin to operate right at this spot. This was mostly due to the fact that this spot was much closer to the roads out west, which led to the farms, all of the fresh fruit produce and animals that were being distributed here and sold to Sydney-siders in the early days. Other goods that came in by boats and ships would land at a wharf that was constructed just west of here in what's Darling Harbour today, roughly where the Pyrmont Bridge is. That's why the street that runs from the water at Darling Harbour up to the northern end of the Queen Victoria building is still called Market Street today. The markets were held in a cross-shaped building which had been in part designed by Francis Greenway, the notorious convict architect who served over the Macquarie years in the 1810s and 20s. So if we could shoot back 200 years right on this site, we'd see a very busy marketplace with lots of fruit and veggie sales and also butchers, meat and poultry. There would be livestock sales as well, and imagine turkeys, pigs, chickens, goats, and vendors haggling over the top of each other for business, something you might still find in an old-fashioned country farmer's market. By the 1840s, the sale of livestock had moved to another market in town, and that also sold animal feed and hay. Today we still know this area in Sydney as Haymarket, and that is where you'll find modern-day Chinatown. But by the 1850s, Sydney was going through a real economic boom. There was simply more money to spend, thanks in part to the gold rush, immigration, trade, and investment. This led to the development of many new commercial premises, warehouses, shops and offices around this area. And before long, that major civil structure of Town Hall was starting to be erected right next door. So it meant that by the 1880s, Sydney Council really felt that this old marketplace building needed an upgrade to match the rest of the city around it. Other shopping arcades that were filled with boutique and artisan stores and more of a retail environment were starting to pop up in Sydney. And the council was keen to cash in on the demand for luxury goods, and to attract both the best shopkeepers and customers, they felt that a monumental complex that had everything in the one spot would serve them much better than an old-fashioned produce market. So it was in the year 1888, remember that's the centenary year for the colony of Sydney, the newly appointed colonial architect, George McRae, was commissioned to design 4 different architectural styles of the building that could be handed to a committee. These plans would take him 5 years. In the end, the modern grandeur of the American Romanesque style won out, and a foundation stone was laid by 1893 to get started. But right at the same time, in the 1890s, a huge economic crash took a hold of Australia, and Sydney really fell into a depression. But instead of scaling back the project, the City Council thought that this big construction might be a good opportunity to employ many craftsmen who would otherwise be out of work during this time of depression. So it was all hands on deck, and thousands of tons of a superior grade of sandstone were quarried from Pyrmont and then sculpted, and bit by bit the colossal walls of this structure would begin to rise. But the real standout feature was the enormous central dome, which was sheeted in copper, and alongside the other 20 smaller domes or cupolas really gave the building a unique appearance and dominated the skyline of Sydney, and it wouldn't be long before the copper dome started to turn that lovely mossy green colour. The central dome was the largest in the southern hemisphere at the time, with a 19-metre diameter. I recommend taking in the dome from a couple of different angles, and I've included a photo of the workmen on top just as they were finishing it off at the end of the 19th century. But also, if you get the chance, go inside the Queen Victoria building. You can go through the beautiful staircase right in the centre of the structure and peer upwards, and you'll see the lovely stained glass which decorates the internal ceiling. And despite the depression, the architect managed to secure the best of the best building materials and polished off the interior with lovely tiles imported from Europe and stained glass windows throughout. With many hands put to work, the building was up and ready to be opened in only 5 years. At the grand opening ceremony in 1898, the mayor of the time described the complex as somewhere that would establish a marvellous centre of trade. He also stated that a less costly building would have provided ample market accommodation, but it would have been short-sighted to have only studied the present to the exclusion of that great future which far-seeing men will agree will be almost infinite in possibilities. You get a real sense of the optimism of that age. When it came to naming the building, it was thought that the Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria, which had taken place 1 year earlier in 1897, was such a significant event. She'd been on the throne for 60 years, so that this last major structure of the 19th century completed in Sydney would be named in her honour. The building itself took up an entire city block and had a 3-storey arcade inside. And in the opening year, on the ground floor, 58 shops opened up with a variety of tenants, including tailors, mercers, boot importers, hairdressers, tobacconists, florists, chemists, fruit sellers, and also a tea room. The tea room was an extraordinary success, and it was run by a very interesting individual named Mi Quong Tat. Quong Tat was a Chinese-Australian businessman. He'd arrived in New South Wales from China as a young boy and was raised by a Scottish family, which really taught him how to act as the quintessential Victorian gentleman. He even played the bagpipes, and he was very sophisticated. He struck gold at quite a young age and moved his business enterprises to Sydney, where he got into all sorts of trade and started these very, very popular tea rooms. The tea rooms were large social meeting places. They offered tea and refreshments and catered to huge upmarket lunches, particularly for ladies in high society. Whilst Quong Tat had started other tea rooms in Sydney, his Queen Victoria premises proved to be a real success story and was beautifully decorated. It even had fountains and pools with carp swimming about and could fit about 500 people. Sadly, right at the height of his business career, Quong Tat was attacked in his office at the tea rooms inside the Queen Victoria building in 1903. It seemed like a robbery break-in gone wrong, but Mi Quong Tat was a representative of the Chinese community in Sydney, and it was thought there could have been some political motivation behind the attack as well. He would die from his injuries, and the tea rooms would go with him. On the first floor of the building was a couple of dozen showrooms and other commercial exhibitions. And then right at the top on the second floor, there were other rooms, a gallery and a coffee palace, which featured a dining room, sitting, drawing and public rooms, 57 bedrooms where people could stay, and a promenade where you could look down on everybody else. So it really was quite the structure. And in the basement, you'd also find strong room, storage, cooling chamber, a cellar for wine, and also public toilets. However, one big problem from the beginning was that the building had opened right in the middle of a financial depression. So whilst it looked the part, many shopkeepers couldn't afford the high rents that the city council was charging to make their money back on the investment they'd made, which led to a large amount of unused space as shops remained closed and empty inside the building. To fill those spaces, the council ended up moving many of its offices dealing with city matters inside the structure itself, and various refittings and renovations to try and make it suitable as a place of business and a place of administration led to it losing a lot of its old world charm over the course of the 20th century. And as crazy as it sounds, by the 1950s, many people regarded it as an eyesore. Architectural tastes had certainly changed, and for a building that looked so decorative, over the top and Victorian, it seemed to be the relic of another age, and Sydney was trying to modernise with concrete high-rise buildings and office spaces all around it. So despite it being such an incredible structure, plans to tear it down were put forward. Some people wanted an open civic square where it had sat, and others wanted to knock up something as fantastic as a car park on that site. Luckily, these plans were stalled mainly due to a lack of money from the city council. But it was clear by the 1970s that the building itself was run down, only partially occupied as a shopping centre, and had really lost its original identity and purpose. So something did need to be done. But the catalyst for its eventual restoration came in an unexpected and tragic way in 1978. This event in Sydney is known as the Hilton bombing, and occurred when a meeting for the heads of Commonwealth countries were stationed at the Hilton Hotel right next door to the Queen Victoria building. and a terrorist placed a bomb inside a garbage bin just outside of the hotel. It did go off, but it was 2 garbage men and a police officer that it killed and injured 9 others. Not only that, the explosion shattered so much of the stained glass windows of the QVB. In the aftermath of the tragedy, it was clear that the QVB not only needed restoration, it needed serious repair, and luckily by 1983, a Malaysian financial company stepped in to save the building and brought in all sorts of heritage experts to restore the entire complex inside and out to its former glory at the end of the 19th century. So after a lot of work, the grand building was back in action. The Malaysian company took on a 99-year lease. The huge statue of Queen Victoria herself was placed outside, and these days it is very much regarded by Sydney as an historic gem in the centre of the city and open for all to explore. If you're wandering through, make sure you get a chance to have a look at its eccentric historic clocks that hang from the ceiling, and I recommend going right to the top level and having a look down through all of the arcades. A great sense of light and space and people watching.